Hello there, welcome to my living room. And I only mention that because those of you who are listening to the podcast, it'll sound like there is some white noise going on. And that's because I've got a fire going. So it's a hot white noise that is going on. But welcome to my living room. Welcome to a new year. This is our first episode of the new year. And not only that, to a new decade. Think about that for a few moments. Where were you 10 years ago? Where were you living? What were you doing? What's unfolded over this last decade? And what may God be doing in your story over this next decade? For some of you, that's really exhilarating to think about. For maybe some of you, that's overwhelming. So we'll just kind of let that be. But as we jump into this new year, I'm really excited about what we're going to be tackling over the next number of episodes. So for those of you who've been following along, we have been talking about Jesus and his explosive parables. And what we've been doing is we've been choosing a parable and then spending however many episodes necessary to unpack what is going on there. And so a number of you have been curious as to whether or not we were going to continue this into the new year. And I want to look at one more parable. And then at some point in time, we'll come back to the parables in the future. But there is one parable in particular that many of you have been wondering if we were going to tackle. And the answer is we are. It is the most well-known, most well-loved of all of Jesus' parables, or in connection to the parable of the Good Samaritan, and that is the parable of the Prodigal Son. And we're going to be calling this the parable of the lost son. And as we're doing with all of the parables and any story in the Bible, is we've got to get a context for the reason why Jesus even told the story in the first place. And so I'd like to invite you to Luke chapter 15, and I'm just going to read the first two verses of Luke 15 because that provides the context for what is to come, and the story that we know so well from Jesus is on the heels of this. Verse 1 of chapter 15, it says this: "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" So there you go. There's the two verses. And then out of this, Jesus is not going to launch right into the parable of the lost son. He's going to actually tell the parable of the lost sheep, and then the parable of the lost coin, and then the parable of the lost son. And all three of these are working in a symbiotic relationship together. You have to understand them as a whole. And so before we can jump headlong into the parable of the lost son, we're going to need to spend an episode looking at the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin. But we're going to do that in the next episode. What I want to do for our time in this episode is to try to understand what in the world is going on in these first two verses, because it is this that Jesus launches from in order to tell these three stories, including the one that we love so well. And so let me read this first verse again. "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus." So we have two groups of people. We have the tax collectors and we have the sinners. Now, for those of you who watched or listened to our Zacchaeus story, we gave you a full breakdown of what it meant to be a tax collector. So here's just a really quick summary. Rome is ruling the entire world, and in order to fund their military machine and their empire, they exact taxes from the people that they have conquered. And what would happen is that typically a local Jewish person would be tapped as a chief tax collector who would then hire other Jewish people, tax collectors, to exact taxes from the rest of the Jewish people. So think about this for a moment. A tax collector comes to your door to exact taxes, and it's a fellow Jew taking your money to hand over to the empire, who calls their leader Lord and God, aka Caesar. This is very problematic. And so tax collectors were seen as traitors among the Jewish people, and they were among the most despised because of what they did. The sinners, the other category of people we have here in Luke 15, can constitute a range of types of people in the book of Luke. A sinner can be someone who is not religious. They are not living a righteous life. They don't follow the commandments of God. That is considered a sinner. You can have someone who is actually a follower of God, but someone who is living a very self-centered lifestyle that actually hurts the rest of the community. That is considered to be a sinner. A sinner can also constitute someone whose life is an absolute mess. They're just in shambles. And those who would be part of the tax collectors and sinners would be understood in the reading of Luke as people who are on the margins, those who are on the fringes, especially for the religious leaders who are the Pharisees and the teachers of the Torah here. They would see them in many ways as those who are on the outside. They're not near the hot spot of God's good graces because their life is in shambles or they've made poor decisions. They are on the margin. And it's these folks that Jesus is interacting with. And this is why the religious leaders are so upset, is they say that in verse 2 it says the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, which is not a favorable term. It means that they're angry. It means that they're grumbling. It means they're upset. In fact, it's the same word that is used in the Hebrew scriptures during the time that Israel's in the desert, when they are angry at God and angry at Moses, and they're grumbling and muttering. And for those of you who are from a linguistic perspective, will know, how do we know that? It's something called the Septuagint. It's a translation from the Hebrew into the Greek. So the Hebrew Older Testament was translated into Greek. And so when we look at those Greek words and we look at the Greek of the New Testament, we can see those parallels. And so that parallel is there. And so they're angry, they're amped up, they're upset, and they say why. They say this, Jesus, talking about Jesus, this man welcomes sinners and he eats with them. That's the problem. It's the eating together. Because it's not just one thing to welcome, but to have a meal in the ancient world was a sign of social acceptance and love. These people's lives who are just a mess, Jesus is sharing a meal with them. Now, I don't want to do a deep dive into the implications of this because in episode 87, we actually talked about this in the parable of the rich fool, subtitle, Imagine the Good. We talked about how Jesus never watered down his convictions, and yet people flocked to Jesus. They wanted to be with Jesus, even though they knew exactly where he stood. Jesus had this amazing balance of being able to hold tight to his convictions, but to love people well. We talked about how this isn't blanket tolerance of people's actions and behaviors and all of that. And so go back to episode 87 if you don't remember that, or if you didn't have a chance to watch or listen to that, in order to get more of a context around how Jesus did that. But for our purposes here, I just want to highlight the fact that it is the religious leaders here who are angry at Jesus for welcoming those who are on the outside, those lives whose lives were in shambles, and sharing a meal, a sign of social love and acceptance. That's a problem for Jesus. And it's precisely why he tells the three stories he does out of it. Now, let me just ask you this question. What do you think is the religious leader's problem in this particular story? Why do you think that they have this perspective with Jesus? Because if you go back to the scriptures, these scriptures that they know and love and teach on a daily basis, have passages where God says, I want you to leave the corners of your field so that the poor, the widow, the oppressed, they can come and get what they need. You've got passages in Deuteronomy where God goes, I love the widow, I love the orphan, I love the oppressed, I love those who are on the outside, and you should love them as well. And over and over and over in the scriptures, God demonstrates himself as a God of love and a God of grace and a God of mercy and a God of forgiveness to all people. And yet the religious leaders do not like the fact that Jesus is extending that kind of grace, that kind of love, and that kind of mercy to people who are on the outside. What is their problem? Well, I think it's a big problem that apparently takes Jesus 3 stories to unpack, and so we're going to kind of chip away at that over the next several episodes. But I do think that there is one core issue that is unfolding in Luke 15, 1 and 2, and I wish I could just say this was someone else's problem and not my own, but I can't. So a number of years ago, I was studying the words of Jesus and reading through all of the words of Jesus, like gospel after gospel after gospel. I got done with one, I went to the next, and I just really wanted to make sure that I knew all of the words of Jesus, and not at the exclusion of the rest of the biblical story. As you know, if you've been following me in the teaching series, the entire Bible, from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22, it is one big, beautiful, unified story, and we need to understand it all. Jesus was living out his Bible, which was the Hebrew Scriptures, and so the better we understand Jesus' Bible, the better we're going to understand his mission and what he was doing. And so I'm reading through all of the words of Jesus, and granted, I have been teaching the Bible for more than a decade at this point, teaching the words of Jesus, loving the words of Jesus. And I remember a couple of years ago, God stopping me in my tracks and challenging me with what I believe God was saying through these words was this: Brad, you know the stories of Jesus, but you are not living fully the stories of Jesus. And that hit me so hard that I knew the stories. I taught these stories. And in some way, I was living out these stories, but I wasn't fully living out all the stories, or I wasn't fully living out these stories in its fullest detail. And I believe, friends, this is exactly what's going on with the religious leaders. I do think that there are other issues involved, and we're going to get into those in the coming weeks. But I do think that there was an issue that they knew the story, but they weren't living out the story. Now, we're at the beginning of not only a new year, but of a new decade. And one of the things that is going on at the church that my family and I are part of in Franklin, Tennessee, is that we're going through a 21-day fast right now. And for some people, they're fasting from 1 meal. Some people are fasting from 2 meals. Some people are fasting from 3 meals a day. And however people are choosing to fast, this was the invitation. And so I have jumped in to this fast. And the thing that I always do, as you know from my rhythms, is I do the best I can to get to bed early so I can get up early and spend time in prayer. But one of the things that I've been doing additionally during my quiet time in the morning is that in this 21-day fast, there is a podcast that goes along with each day, and there's a reading that we get emailed. And there's a dude by the name of Anthony Skinner. We call him like the Morgan Freeman of our church. He's got this amazing voice, and he's walking us through like a centered prayer every day. And a few days ago, he was asking us to think about a word that may come to mind that we believe God wants us to center ourselves around. It could be a name of God. It could just be a word in general. And I'm not typically one of these people. I know maybe many of you choose a word for the year. That's typically never been my MO. But this word came into my mind, and it has not left. And that is the word purification. And so the reason why we're doing this teaching in my living room is because normally I'm in my office in the mornings, but I have been coming in to the living room. Because one of the things that I do in my office is I always light a candle. It reminds me of God's presence. And I've been actually coming into the living room where I've turned on the fire. Not only to have kind of amplified light, but amplified heat, because I'm always cold, and it's in the winter months here in Nashville, and it's not like being in West Michigan, I know, but I still am chilled in the morning, and so I enjoy that. But what I also love is the picture that is above our fireplace. And for those of you who know Hebrew or have recognized God's name in Hebrew, this is God's intimate, personal, covenantal name, Yahweh, that he gives in Exodus chapter 3. And this has been in all of our homes for like the last 7-8 years, something like that. And I absolutely love having this here because it reminds me that we are under God, and it's a reminder that God is part of our home, His presence is here. But even more than that is that God gives His intimate, personal, covenantal name in Exodus 3 for the first time at the front end of the Exodus story. And this is another teaching that we can talk about at some other time, and I may have actually referenced it in the teaching series at some point, but that God gives His name, and the name was an indication of your identity, of your essence. And I believe that God says, Moses, I'm giving you my name so that you will know what I am like, and that this is a God who rescues and redeems. And we see that in the Exodus story, we see that with Jesus and the cross and the empty tomb, and we see this is a God who is always seeking to rescue people. And so as I have been taking this chair, I've been turning it around in the morning, I've been facing the name of God and looking at the fire and being reminded of the presence of God, but also the fire is a purifying thing. And as I've been thinking about this word purification, what has been coming into my mind is this challenge of God saying, Brad, where do I need to show you that you're not living out my story? Or that's what my plea has been. God, show me where am I knowing the story but not living the story. That I want you to burn that off of me, burn that out of me, and help me to see where I've got really good at knowing and teaching but not living. And that's the challenge that I have for you as well. That's what I want to leave you with, is what does it look like for you not to just know the story, but to live the story? And as we're going to find in this mini-series on the parable of the lost son, is that in Luke, Jesus has been giving us these anchor points about what His mission is about. And when we come to Luke 15, this is just another place where Jesus is not just teaching the story, He has fully embodied the story. He is the Word made flesh, and He is embodying for us the heart, the mission, and the essence of God. And He is saying, you need to do likewise. And I pray that for us, as we go through these episodes, as next week we're going to talk about just the posture of other people and what it means to pursue them. And then as we get into the parable of the lost son, we're going to look at it through the eyes of the younger son and the older son and the father. Is that I believe that this series is seminal to recalibrating us to the heart of who God is, what it means to follow Jesus, and what it means to embody the story, not to just know and understand the story. And so I pray that this is something that just reverberates in your heart and your soul. Don't just know the story, live the story. But in order to live the story, we need to better understand the story. But may it never stop at knowledge. May we always walk out the text as people who are obedient to the mission and call of Jesus Christ in our life. And so Happy New Year to you, happy decade to you, and may, as we go through this year in our life, be people who don't just hear the Word, study the Word, understand the Word, but walk out and live the Word. So friends, thanks so much for watching, thanks for listening, and may we truly walk out this text in our lives.